Okay, in this set of videos, I'm going to go over the topics from Chapter 2. So in Chapter 2, we're getting into formulas and functions, okay? We've done actually a little bit of this in Chapter 1, because this really is kind of the basics of Excel. So we've already created some formulas, but we're going to dig a little bit deeper into how to create a formula, what the different elements of a formula are, how to audit your formula, particularly if you've got errors. We'll talk about the really important topic of cell referencing. Again, we've done a little of this already, but instead of just simply using Excel as a calculator and hard-coding with numbers, we want to actually use references to the cells, okay? And so it turns out there are a bunch of different ways to reference your cells. And then finally, we're going to get into functions. Again, we've looked at like the sum function, so we've already done a little bit of functions, but we'll talk a little bit more about how functions in general work, the different types of functions. And for this chapter, we're getting into some basics, okay? So later in the semester, we'll get into more complex functions, more advanced functions, but right now I'm just gonna introduce you to a bunch of the basics, which are gonna come in handy throughout the rest of the semester, okay? So let's go ahead and get over into the Excel file for this chapter. If you haven't already downloaded this, you can download this from the Canvas course site. It's the guided example 2 file, has a bunch of different tabs, and we're gonna work through these different tabs as we talk about these topics from chapter 2. By the way, each tab has an instruction box, so if you think you have a good grasp of the topics from this chapter, or you just want to test yourself, feel free to pause this video right now and walk through each tab and see if you can complete what each tab is asking you to do, okay? So that's just a little bit of a test for yourself, or after we go through this, if you want to come back to this tab, or to this file, and try this out again, that could be a good check on whether or not you understand the different topics, okay? But we're going to walk through a lot of this together. So let's start on the rental days tab, okay? And what we're going to want to do is calculate some formulas here. We want to calculate the number of days for any property that's in Minnesota, so MN, or any properties that are in Wisconsin, WI, okay? And so let's come down here. Remember, to create a formula, you have to start with an equal sign. So the equal sign tells Excel that you're calculating something, okay? And so first we want to add the number of days in Minnesota. So I can see up here, Minnesota, I've got the number 44 plus what? Minnesota, I've got the number 14 plus down here the number 31, okay? So I could hit enter. That adds up to 89, okay? But remember, I talked about this last week. That's an example of what's called hard coding. We're hard coding that formula, which means that let's say that this was an error and actually this number should be 32. Notice that the calculation did not update, okay? So I'm going to undo that, Command Z to undo. I want to turn that back to 31. Okay, so a better way to do this is not to hard code it with the numbers, but instead we want to use cell references. Okay, so again, I'm going to hit equals, and now let's actually just click on the cells for Minnesota. So I'm going to click on cell D7 plus, let's see, cell D15 plus cell D19. Okay, so notice I have equals D7 plus D15 plus D19. By the way, I could have just simply typed that. Okay, I don't have to click on the cells. I could type. I will tell you that as you get going in Excel, you'll get used to just actually selecting the cells that you want to include in your formulas rather than typing the cell references. Because if I type the cell reference, again, it's easy to make a typo. Whereas if I know exactly what cells I want to include and I click on them, then I'm less apt to make an error. Okay, and now let's hit return. And again, it equals up to 89. But notice if I change this 31 to 32, that updates my calculation to 90, which is what I want. Okay, now again, I'm going to hit Command Z. Let's undo that. Okay, so it goes back to 89. And something I want to point out, when you use cell references in a formula, so if I double click in here, I'm now kind of in edit mode where I can edit this formula. Notice down here it says edit. Okay, and notice the color coding. Okay, so it actually helps me. This is something in Excel called rangefinder. The rangefinder is helping me find the ranges. In this case, I just have cells, but it's using color coding to kind of give me a sense of what I'm including. It's telling me I'm using that plus that plus that. Okay, that's often very useful, particularly if you're going to audit your formula, if you're going to check your formula to make sure that you're doing the right thing. When you kind of double click into the formula and you look at the rangefinder, you look at the color coding, that will help you make sure that you've got the right thing. And notice, by the way, when I'm in the rangefinder, when I'm in this edit mode, let's say that I actually wanted to include this cell instead of that one. Notice when I hover over the box, I put that little hand, I can click down, I could drag that up, and it actually changes the reference. Notice it changed the reference to D14, and I hit enter, and it gives me a different answer. Now, I didn't want that. I actually want this to be cell D15 because it's Minnesota, okay? But notice when you're kind of in this view, you can actually grab these boxes and move them over it, right? I can move it over here, I can move it over here, okay, but I want it right there, okay? And then you just hit return to get out of that edit mode, okay? And notice now I'm in ready mode. So pause the video. I'm not going to go to the next part yet, but pause the video. See if you can calculate the number of Wisconsin days. So we want any calculation with WI. Okay, take a moment. See if you can get that without me going through it. Okay, so let me just walk through that. So again, equals, and I want Wisconsin, so I'm going to do, what is that, D6 plus D8 plus D10. And I believe that's it. Okay, I'm going to hit enter or return, and I get 114. Okay, and again, if I double click on that, I can see that those are cells that I've referenced. Okay, just to kind of walk through the elements of a formula, notice I hid a column over here. I hid column, what's that, J, K, L. I hid column L. So let's unhide that. Go ahead, select K and M. So select both those columns, and then right click and unhide. Okay, and it'll show you column L. I've got the elements of a formula here. So I just want to go over this and make sure we're all on the same page with this. So once again, I always have to start my formulas with an equal sign. Okay, that's how you tell Excel that you're doing calculations. I can include arithmetic operators, so math, basically. And in fact, often I do. So plus and minus, that kind of makes sense. The asterisk means multiplication. The forward slash means division. And then that little caret symbol, that's how to do exponent. Okay, to do an exponent, I would use a little caret symbol. Okay, now formulas can include constants. Constants are just numbers. Okay, so equals 6 plus 7. I could use this as a calculator. I can use cell references, so B6 plus B, B5 plus B6. Okay, I could do something like that. I could use functions in my formulas. So we've done that before. We've used the sum function. Often you're doing a mix of all that stuff, right? So often our formulas have a bunch of different stuff. So in this case, I'm using a function, I'm using an arithmetic operator, I'm using plus, as well as the division, and I'm using some cell references. Okay, I could also be using a constant. I could have a constant number if for some reason I needed that. So again, often formulas have a mix of all of those things, okay? But the key is that all formulas must start with the equal sign. That's how you tell Excel that you're gonna be doing a calculation, okay? Let us skip over to the break even tab. So go ahead, click on the break even tab, because I want to show you sometimes Excel will detect that you've got an error in your formula. Okay, and the way that it tells you that it thinks you've got an error is you'll see this little green. That little green thing right there in the upper left corner of the cell. And actually go ahead, click on cell B10, and notice now I have an exclamation point. Okay, and I get to click, so if I hover over it, it actually gives me a sense of what the error is. So this formula refers to a range that has additional functions. Okay. And again, so let's double click in the function in the formula just to kind of get that range finder, the shading. And that's what it's telling me is that I'm using the sum function for these cells, and this error is saying, well, you didn't include this one, and it's kind of saying we think you should include that one. Okay. Now sometimes you don't include something that's adjacent, and that's correct. Okay, so you should not take this error message to mean that Excel is absolutely correct. Sometimes it's telling you it thinks there's an error, but it actually isn't an error. But sometimes it is an error. In this case, it actually is. In this case, I should have summed up all of those cells. I should have summed up from cell C5 to C9. I'm sorry, B5 to B9, not B5 to B8. Okay. Now let's just look at some other options here. So if I click on the drop down, it gives me some information. Okay. By the way, if you go to the formulas tab up here, actually hit the return key. Let's get out of edit mode. Go to the formulas tab. Okay, and notice you've got this formula auditing section of the formulas tab. This gives you some tools that you can use to look for errors or to detect how your functions and formulas are working. So go ahead, click on trace precedence. I'm sorry, you have to click on the cell that has the formula. Okay, so go ahead, click on cell B10, and then trace precedence. And what trace precedence does is it's kind of giving you an arrow, actually. It's saying what cell or cells or range of cells goes into that formula. And in this case, it's saying that's this range, this box, is what's being used in that formula. And again, that can be useful, particularly if you've got a more complex formula. This formula is pretty straightforward, but sometimes you'll have multiple cells, and so you'll have multiple arrows kind of showing you which cells go into that formula. Okay. If you want to get rid of the arrows, you can come over here and remove the arrows. Okay. And you've got some options here, but I'm just going to remove the arrows. Okay. That's how you get rid of the arrows. Trace dependence. I don't have any dependence here, but what that means is, let's say that I had another function. So, okay, let me do this. Equals this cell plus 1. Okay. Now, if I click trace dependence, it would say, aha, I'm using this cell in that formula right there. Okay. So that's what trace dependence would do. Okay. Let's remove the arrows. And again, I'm going to delete this. I don't really need that. Okay. So that's what trace dependence and trace precedence does. Okay. Come back here. Let's click on D10. And the nice thing here, when I click on the drop down, particularly if I know that I made the mistake, I can update the formula to include the cell. So it's typically going to give you a suggestion for how to fix it. Okay. And so if I click on this, there I go. It just updated. Notice now I've got that entire range of cells. It updated the formula. Okay. So again, that's very useful to be able to fix your errors. Okay. Now let's come down here. I want to calculate the rent necessary to break even. Okay. So in the instructions here, you can say that this is calculated as the total fixed costs. So this cell right here, C21, divided by 1 minus the total variable costs. Okay. So divided by 1 minus B10. Okay. So again, go ahead, see if you can enter that formula and see what you get for your. So go ahead and pause the video, see if you can calculate that formula. Okay, so let's actually do this. So again, I'm going to say take C21 divided by, okay, and you might have done this. You might have said 1 minus B10. Okay, and if you hit enter, that's actually the wrong answer. Okay, the correct answer is actually C21 divided by, and then in parentheses, 1 minus B10. 52,061 is the correct answer. Okay, very different answer. Very different answer. So what's going on here? What's going on here has to do with the order of operations. So once again, you can see I've hidden some columns here. Go ahead, select columns I and K. You can actually double click. That also unhides a column. Okay, basically, Excel is similar to math, right? So if you might have heard of PEMDAS, PEMDAS is the order in which calculations get made. And so first, Excel starts with anything that's in parentheses, and it will calculate anything in parentheses. Okay. Next, it figures out anything that's being exponentiated. So 2 raised to the power of 3, or B5 raised to the power of 5. Okay, those are exponents. It would do that next. It next does multiplication and division, so multiplication and division are on the same level. And basically, if I've got multiple things in the same formula, it goes left to right, okay? And then finally, after doing all of that, we then take care of addition and subtraction. And again, those are tied, so it would go left to right to figure that stuff out. So if I come over here, and I look at this formula, when I took out the parentheses, when I did not include the parentheses, let's just think of what's happening here. In this formula, I've got division and I've got subtraction. So if I come over here, it's going to do division first, and then subtraction. So it's going to say C21 divided by 1. Well, guess what? C21 divided by 1 is just C21. So all that was happening is it was taking C21 minus B10, okay? That's how you got 29,544.57. Okay, it basically deducted 0.43 from that number. Okay, that's not what we wanted. So by putting parentheses around, here we go. If I put parentheses around the 1 minus B10, now let's think about what's happening. Okay, what's happening here is it's first starting with the parentheses. It's going to calculate what's in the parentheses at first. So 1 minus B10. Well, 1 minus B10 is going to be, what is that? 57%. Okay, so it evaluates that to 57%, and then next it does the division. C21 divided by 57%. And that's where I get to $52,061.67. Okay, so really important to understand the order of operations if you've got multiple things going on in the same formula. It's the same rules as in math. Okay, so there's nothing too complicated about this if you know how it works in math. Same thing in Excel. And my rule of thumb is if you've got multiple things going on and you're not quite sure of what the order is, use parentheses. Okay, parentheses are your friend, so you can always use parentheses to make sure that Excel calculates things in the order and in the grouping that you want it to calculate things in. Okay, so parentheses are your friend. Don't be afraid of using parentheses in your formulas. Okay. One last thing I'm going to show you on this tab. So notice again under formulas, in the formula auditing section, I could show the formulas. Okay, right now it's showing me the result, but if I click show formulas, it actually shows me all these formulas. Okay, sometimes you might want that. Okay, sometimes you might want to actually kind of have a view where you can see all your formulas, and again, maybe that's going to help you as you audit the formulas. You can actually see what are the calculations being made on this tab, on this worksheet. Okay, let's go over to the rental income worksheet. Okay, here's what I'd like you to do. So in a moment, I'm going to stop this video. So I'm going to stop part A. Before you go on to part B, I want you to calculate the income for all of these cells. So I want you to calculate E5 up through E19. And this is going to be calculated as the total. So for this one, it's going to be D5 times the rate for this property. So this property, Hilltop Getaway. Notice on the rates tab, so over here on the rates tab, that Hilltop Getaway has that rate. So I basically want you to take the total number of days, so D5, times the rate that's over here on this tab. So times D5 from this tab, okay? And do the same thing for all of these, okay? See if you can figure that out. Okay, see if you can figure out how to do that calculation. Come back to part B, and I will walk through it together with you.